joining. It's such a pleasure to be here. And I can see that we have over 100 participants right now from all over the world. So I thought it would be a very nice activity for me to get to know you a little bit more by knowing where you're connecting from. So I actually found this interactive map, and I'm going to share with you in the chat box a link. So you can click on the link, write your name, and I hope you remember your geography lessons. I hope you can find your country on a map so that you can place, the pin where you are connecting right now. And then I should be able to see live, and then I can share my screen with you. Let's see. I'll wait a couple of seconds because you have to type in your name so you can get access. Oh, yes, it's working. Look at that. So a lot of people from Argentina, I suppose, yes. Someone from Canada, someone, I don't know if that's Romania, no, probably Montenegro, or I don't know, Serbia maybe. Excellent. So if you were not able to connect, you can just type in Polev, P-O-L-L, as you can see there on the screen, right? lev.com/André Hedlund 505, and then you should be able to do it. Wow, we have some people from, I think that was Malaysia maybe? Yeah, Indonesia? Wow. Isn't it too early for you there right now? Okay, I really appreciate you joining us today. So I'm gonna leave this map here for you to tell us where you're connecting from. And then I'm going back to my slides, and then we can start the presentation. And as Anna has mentioned, you can of course use the chat box to ask questions whenever you want. I will try to focus on 4 big trends that I got from the questions you sent through the form, the Google form that was set up for you. And of course, at the end of the session, we will have a couple of minutes to address more specific questions you might have, all right? So now I'm gonna stop sharing the screen, and I'm going back to my slides. And today we're going to talk about engagement. So the very first thing I would like you to do, since I don't really have a lot of room to interact with you, is what comes to your mind when you think about engagement? And I want you to share that in the chat box. So what is a word maybe that comes to your mind when you think about this term, engagement? And please let me know if you can see my presentation now. It should be coming up. Yes? Thumbs up? Yeah, good. All right. So let me take a look at the chat box to see some of the words that you've mentioned. All right, so you have a couple of things there. Connection, happiness, action, critical thinking, hard work. Excellent. Getting involved, belongingness, okay? So contract, very good. All excellent words. I'm going to show you what a group of teachers thought, what came to their mind when I asked the same question in a couple of minutes, okay? So for you to get to know me a little bit more, because I think that's engaging, I prepared a very quick true or false about my life. So I'm going to ask you 3 questions. Actually, I'm going to say 3 things, and you have to decide whether they're true or false. The best way for you to do that is you can write number 1 or F. Okay, can you hear me? Okay, number 1, so you can put T or F. Number 2, T or F. Number 3, T or F. Okay, got it? So the first statement about my life is that I love llamas. You know llamas? I'm obsessed with llamas, those animals that you can find in South America, in the Andes. So true, 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 true. Okay, false. The second one is that I used to play in a very large band in an orchestra. Is that true or false? Okay, true, true, false. And the last one is that I have a stuffed elephant that travels around the world with me. So, okay, a lot of false, 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 false. Okay, true, excellent. So I think you're going to be a little surprised. Let me show you the answers. The first one, yes, I am obsessed with llamas. Can you see the picture? So this one took me a while to take. Actually, I traveled to Peru with my wife 4 years ago, actually 6 years ago. And I really wanted to take a picture with a llama. And then when we got to go to Machu Picchu, then we found the llama, the proper llama there. And then I asked my wife to take this picture so you can see how happy I am, right? I think they're funny animals. And the next one, yes, it is true. I used to play in a band. Maybe you cannot see me here, but I will try to show you where I am. That was long ago before I had my beard. So, and I used to play the flute, and then I actually moved to the trumpet for a while. And finally, the last one, do I have a stuffed elephant that travels around? Yes, I do. And his name is Mr. Trunk, and he's very, very cool, and he's right here with me. So if anybody wants to know Mr. Trunk a little bit more, you can find him on social media using the hashtag Mr. Trunk Travels. So I'm writing right there for you in the chat box. And I think he's on Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. I'm not sure about the other types of media. He's not, you know, like the younger generations who, you know, TikTok, Snapchat, and things like that. So he's Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. All right. He's a popular guy. Oh, Maria, thank you very much. Well, if you want to follow me on social media, because I post about things related to neuroscience psychology, so here's my information. You can follow my blog as well, edcrocks.com. And I have a page on Facebook. And we also have a page for the special interest group, the Brastiso Mind Brain Education Group. And I'm more active on Instagram. You can find me at EDC Rocks. Okay? Now, let's get started. So what are the objectives of this talk today? We're going to talk about some concepts of engagement and actually differentiate engagement and something else that people normally get confused. And then you will see in a moment. Also, we want to take a look at what psychology can tell us, especially psychology of education and cognitive psychology. What can neuroscience tell us? Because psychology and neuroscience, even though they discuss the same thing in a way, they look from different perspectives. So it's much more about mind versus brain. So the abstract versus the concrete, and we're going to talk about those things. Also, this one is actually to keep you interested and curious. Nirvana Chick sent me hi, and you will only find out at the end of this session. And then I'll try to give you some practical tips based on the science of learning, psychology, and neuroscience. And I bet you didn't know that there will be a raffle. So somebody is going to get something out of this session. Not just one person, but a couple of people, and I'll tell you throughout the presentation. Now, this is my wonderful, brilliant professor, Paul Howard-Jones. He's one of the leading educational neuroscientists in the world. And he's the director of the Psychology of Education course at the University of Bristol in the UK. And he normally says something that I think applies here. Why did you come to this session? So what got you interested in this session? And I think it's because neuroscience is sexy. And so basically what he's saying is that whenever you have a talk about the brain, it attracts people. People want to know more about the brain. They're curious about the brain. But this can also be very dangerous because you never know what the expertise of the person is. And there are some people selling magical solutions just because they have brain in the term or in the title of their sessions. So we have to be very careful with what we learn from neuroscience. And even though it is sexy, it's also very much to the ground, so it's very much based on evidence. And we have to look at the evidence and try to come up with a couple of solutions. It's not magical, really. So I'm not going to be able to give you a fixed recipe for you to engage your students, but I will maybe help you reflect on certain things you might be able to do. And that brings me to this topic that is probably one of my biggest passions nowadays in terms of studying. There is an area, a transdisciplinary area called the mind-brain education area that basically puts together 3 areas that should be communicating all the time. Which area studies the mind? So can you type in your chat box there? So what is the science that studies the mind? Can you see my presentation? Somebody just mentioned that they can't see the presentation. You can, right? Okay, good. Psychology, well done. Psychology studies the mind. And then we have B for brain. So which area studies the brain? Neuroscience, exactly. And then we have E for the area that studies education. So which area is that? This one is hard, right? Which area studies education? Methodology, pedagogy, excellent. Well, actually, education is studied by education, but yes, we have different segments within education. So when we're talking about education for kids, we normally refer to pedagogy, but we also have andragogy for adults nowadays. And we even have other fields within education that we can mention. So let's think in broader terms of education. Now, one thing that I really want to stress here is that no area is better than the other. That was what Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa intended. We don't think that neuroscience is better than education because people who do neuroscience, who study neuroscience, may not have any experience in teaching. And they cannot tell you, teacher, what you should be doing in your classroom. And that's very important because, again, neuroscience is sexy, but neuroscience has to look at what is being done in the classroom and then see what's happening in the brain and then suggest, recommend things, not impose things. So don't trust anyone who comes to you and says, I have studied neuroscience. I have all the answers for you, teacher, when you are teaching your students because they're going to learn better because it's based on the brain and how the brain works. It doesn't work like that. That's why I like very much those, this image, because you can see that they're at the same level. And then basically what the mind-brain education science does is, okay, what is happening in the classroom? What are teachers doing? What are the strategies that they're using? Great. Does psychology have a theory to explain those things? And then, yes, we can find a theory that explains those things. Great. And then when you check what's going on inside their brains using an fMRI machine, for example, magnetic resonance imaging, can we see certain areas of the brain light up that are supposed to be lighting up? Yes, which means that we have evidence from education, neuroscience, and psychology. So whatever the teacher is doing is probably right or effective. Now, if you don't have, okay, somebody's drawing an arrow now on the presentation. It's not me, I promise. But anyway, if you don't have evidence from psychology to support what teachers are doing in the classroom, and you don't have evidence from neuroscience to support what teachers are doing, so that probably doesn't work very well. It's probably ineffective. And then we have to rethink. That's the idea, right? You can watch a whole session that I recorded for practice last year before I delivered it face-to-face at the Innovate ELT conference. So you just have to go to my blog, edcrocks.com. So I can just write it here, edcrocks.com. And then it's on the homepage. You just click there. It's a 50-minute or maybe 1 hour session. And then I go over the principles of the mind-brain education. Okay, no more talking about that. Let's talk about, oh, I forgot my two wonderful colleagues who are also members of the SIG. So you can follow them on social media, Rodolfo Maciello. So you can follow Maciello Consultoria on Instagram, and Mirella Ramaciotti, our leader. So she has a page on Facebook, and she also has a profile, Neuroeducamente, okay? Now we can start talking about the topic. So what is engagement? You actually wrote a couple of words in the chat box that relate to the words that I have been asking around. So I asked a bunch of teachers, what comes to your mind when you think of engagement? And you can see from this word cloud here that the main thing they relate engagement to is motivation, right? And I think you also probably came to the same word when you were talking about motivation. I mean, when you were relating it to engagement, because for some reason, we confuse or interchange, I'd say, those two words, right? So motivation and engagement, they walk hand in hand. But are they the same thing? That's the big question. So some authors in the literature are probably going to say, yeah, they're basically the same thing. We can use engagement and motivation in the same scenario most of the time. But some other authors are going to say that, no, they are very different things. And I'm going to talk more about those authors who separate engagement from motivation. But they are part of the same process or the same system in a way. So what is engagement if it's not motivation? So according to Schlechte, Philip Schlechte, or Schlechte, you know, if you're going back to the origins, the German origins, engagement is much more task dependent, which means that you can be engaged now, right? It's very much related to this moment right now, this task I'm doing. So right now, you're listening to this guy from Brazil talking about engagement. If you are engaged, you're here. So your cognition is working so that you can pay attention to whatever I'm saying. You are emotionally present and you are behaving in a certain way that makes you pay attention to what I'm saying, get involved, and things like that. But it's about this moment here. It's not long-term. So it's a task per task sort of system, right? And then he also mentions that for you to be truly engaged, you need to be engaged in a behavioral way. You have to be also engaged in a cognitive way and in an emotional way. So if you cannot attend to whatever it is that you're supposed to do, if, for example, I ask my students to do task A, they have the proper cognition to solve it, okay, but they are not in the right emotional state to be engaged, so they won't be engaged, right? Or maybe they are in the right emotional state. They are, ready to learn. They're ready to pay attention, to be committed to that, but they haven't achieved or reached the cognitive development that is required for them to do that. So if I'm teaching kids, for example, and we think about Piaget's developmental stages, right, of cognition, if I'm trying to do something very complicated and my kids are not at that stage yet, they don't have the cognition to be engaged. It doesn't work. So we always have to think of engagement in terms of behavior, cognition, and emotion. And again, it's task dependent, so it doesn't really last that long. It's quick. It's a moment sort of thing, right? Which brings me to this guy, the Schlechte guy, right? So he says that there are kind of 3 stages for us to evaluate or assess engagement. So if you think about it, the first stage has to do with being active. So engagement is something that you actively do, which means that it requires students to be attentive and in attendance. So they have to be paying attention and attending to the stimulus or stimuli that we are sending them. Because that's how we learn, right? We receive stimuli from the environment, from our teachers, from others, and even from within us, from biological processes going inside of us, right? And then we learn. That's how we learn. If we are not attending to those stimuli, then we're not learning because we're not paying attention. And then the second part he mentions is that students are required to be committed to the tasks. I think there are two typos here. I'm sorry. So missing T and task, I think I inverted the letters. So actually that was a test for you. And find some inherent value in it. So if the students are not committed to the task, but they are paying attention, does that mean that they are learning, that they are actually engaged in the task? And finally, the third part of what Philip Schlechte says is that when students are engaged, they do the task with enthusiasm and diligence. So you can see from whatever they're doing, like their behavior, it's right there, visible, obvious to you that they are engaged. Sometimes students are very good at pretending to be engaged. We know that. But it's very hard to pretend not to be engaged because you can see from their behavior, the things that they are doing, their facial expressions, their body language, that they are engaged. So those are the three parts that Schlechte talks about, which brings me to his theory of different levels of engagement. So based on the three parts, we have to take into consideration that there has to be attention and there has to be commitment for you to be engaged in a task, right? So when you have attention and commitment, high attention, high commit, up, up, that means you are authentically engaged. High attention, high commitment. I'm actually listening to what's happening. I'm looking at my teacher. I'm receiving the environmental stimuli, and I'm committed to whatever it is that I have to do, that I have to accomplish. So high attention, high commitment. But then you have strategic compliance. When you have high attention, but you have low commitment, which means that it might be very hard for me as a teacher to tell whether my student is actually committed or not, or engaged or not. They are paying attention. They're not doing anything else. They're looking at me. They're nodding, but they are not committed to the things that I'm doing. So they lose interest quickly, for example. So it's high attention, but low commitment. And then you have ritual compliance, and that's when you have low attention and low commitment. And then students are normally ritually complying because they don't want to be punished, right? So they pretend they are paying attention and they pretend that they are committed because they know that if you realize that they're not, they're going to suffer the consequences. You're going to call their attention or tell them to do whatever. So they pretend to be there, but maybe they are completely lost and thinking of something different. They might be paying attention, but not that much. And then you have retreatism. So retreatism is when you have zero attention and zero commitment. So they are not paying attention. They might not be, doing anything bad in the sense of misbehaving so that they are disruptive in the class, but they are not there with you. They are lost. They're probably thinking of something else. But again, they might not be a problem so far. They might not be doing anything that will disrupt or interrupt you in the lesson. And then finally, the worst case scenario is rebellion. And I think I don't have to tell you what that is. But in short, rebellion is when their attention is somewhere else. It's diverted attention. There's zero commitment. And they probably do something to disrupt the lesson. So they're going to be paying attention to something completely, unrelated to the lesson. and they're going to be loud, and they're going to be misbehaving, and they're basically going to get in the way of the lesson. So these are the levels of engagement that you should be able to see when you are assessing your students, whether they are there with you or not, right? So you have to have attention and you have to have commitment. And then this is something that I always do with the participants because it's based on neuroscience, right? And cognitive psychology. So this is the active retrieval moment. What I want you to do very quickly, and you can use your chat box, try to remember anything I said so far. So anything you learned or any feeling you had recently because of this presentation, you can use the chat box to answer, okay? What is something that you can remember right now? Okay. I love llamas. Yes, Vanessa. Great. Anything else? Perfect. Task-dependent, levels, enthusiasm. Yes. Yes, very good. A lot of great answers. Different types of behavior. Perfect. Strategic compliance. Very good. Wonderful. So let's move on. What about motivation? So if we talked about engagement, and engagement is not really motivation, what is motivation, right? And I got this picture of two guys running because I think I can use my own life as an example. And I'm not very proud to say that, but I started running a couple of years ago when I moved to the UK for my master's. And whenever I was running, I was very engaged. You know, at the beginning, I was not so engaged. I was searching for an excuse in my brain to stop running, especially when it was really cold and rainy, as it is most of the time in the UK. But then I managed to control my emotions and then carried on. And I was engaged. There were moments that I was fully engaged in the task. But then I was not really motivated to run anymore, because motivation is something that takes long-term commitment. And I haven't run in a very long time since I came back, even before that, which means that, again, I was engaged in the task when I was doing it because it was task dependent. But in the long run, and I chose this very specific expression for this. In the long run, I was not really motivated, because motivation has a lot to do with goal-oriented behavior. It's to accomplish something that takes longer, and it has to do with a sequence of steps and actually sticking to those steps for a very long time. And then if you look at business literature, you will see that people who are motivated, they have three things basically. They have direction. So the what is what they have to do, what their goal, in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. They also have intensity, the how, so how they do things, and they understand how to interleave. They know that now I have to do it harder, now I don't have to do it so hard. But they also have persistence, and that's probably the biggest one here. So you need to know the what, the how, and the how long it takes for you to get there. And that's motivation. So the big question is, you are all teachers, I assume. That's why you're here. Have you ever had a student who was engaged but not motivated in the lesson? And vice versa. The question is, can students be engaged and not motivated? Can they be motivated and not engaged? So yes, sure. Have you ever had an student who does everything, but for some particular reason, whenever you were teaching that task in that lesson, the student felt bored and didn't want to engage in the task? So that happens, right? I mean, they're great. They normally do everything you ask. They're enthusiastic, but that task that you selected didn't work because they were not engaged in the task, right? Yes. And have you ever had students who are incredibly engaged in the lessons? You know, they do the tasks, but then they don't do anything with whatever they learn. They are not motivated in the long run, right? Have you ever had any of those? Yes. So I assume you can see that it's perfectly natural to separate those things. I do think that for you to be motivated in the long run, long-term goal-oriented behavior, you of course have to be engaged many times, but not all the times, right? Sometimes you're not engaged, but you have to be engaged many times. And that brings me to the Simpsons paradox. And I selected the Simpsons because I think the Simpsons are kind of universal. I think you can watch the Simpsons everywhere in the world, right? So I'm very curious. There are people from all over the world here. Is there anybody here who has never heard of the Simpsons? So, and please don't feel ashamed if you haven't, okay? You just say, me, I've never heard of the Simpsons. Because I think they're kind of universal. So if you've never heard of the Simpsons, it's a very popular animated series. I think they've actually had more than 25 seasons or even more. I'm not sure nowadays. And it's about I'd say a dysfunctional, average American family. They're not very special, you know, and they do a lot of funny things. But if you look at the kids in the family, you have Lisa and you have Bart Simpson, right? And I think the pictures, they can probably tell you a little bit about their profiles, their personality. So who do you think enjoys going to school based on the pictures there, Lisa or Bart? What do you think Bart is doing right there? So, you know, and this is so embedded in Bart's personality that the opening of the series, you know, the opening of the show is actually always shows Bart in detention, writing something on the board all the time. So every day you see that scene, right? And Lisa is always happy. She's a geek, like many people would call her. And what is the Simpsons paradox? It has to do with the self-determination theory by Ryan and DC. So they say that there are two kinds of motivation. We have extrinsic motivation that comes from external factors, and then you have intrinsic motivation. And who do you think has intrinsic motivation? Lisa or Bart? So who do you think can actually motivate themselves without any external factors? There you go. Yes, Lisa. So there she is, Lisa Simpson, right? And why do you think she has intrinsic motivation? It could be anything really. It could be genetic. It could be, you know, psychological. Often, everything about us is either genetic and psychological or both, right? It's a combination of nature and nurture. But maybe it could be social. It could be that, you know, girls in many cultures, they are supposed to be nice and quiet and, you know, abide, and then they have to do the things that they're asked. Could be that. It could be that boys are incentivized in a way to be, you know, the bad student, the bad boy, and not care about things. It could be a social thing. It could be all of those things, right? Or simply, like Maria has just mentioned, and Ria, she loves learning. So she's intrinsically motivated because she sees value in what she's doing, and she can control her emotions, cognition, and behavior to stay on task for a very long time. So it's about the long run, right? It's goal oriented, and she's clever as well. Now, there are a couple of things that we can do to help our students develop intrinsic motivation. Because extrinsic motivation are the things that we can bring into the environment. For example, we can give our students rewards, and we can give them prizes. Or, most students, they go to school because they have to go to school in many respects because their parents tell them to go to school, because society expects them to go to schools, and that's a big extrinsic motivator. But how do you develop the more genuine kind of motivation that will actually help your students be more engaged most of the time? Because if they are motivated, long-term, long run, they have to be engaged more times during the tasks that they're doing. So one of the things that you can do, you can work with the ARC principle from Ryan and DC's theory. So the ARC principle tells us that they have to be given autonomy, voice, and choice. So if they go to an environment that they don't say anything, they're always quiet, nobody listens to their opinion, they have to do whatever you tell them to do, then they're not motivated, and they're probably not going to be engaged in the task. They also have to have a sense of relatedness and competence. So relatedness, because they have to feel that they are connected to the group, to the people who are there with them, and that they also have some sort of achievement that they can see that is visible to them. Because if they feel that they're incompetent, that they don't belong in the group, and that their voices are not heard, then they're not going to be motivated. They're not going to be intrinsically motivated. And we can actually talk about Dan Pink. He has a very good TED Talk on this. That is the summary of his book, The Surprising Truth of What Really Motivates Us. And he says, and there was a very interesting experiment that was conducted by the MIT, and they realized that if you give a reward to something, do you get more of that behavior? That was the question. And if you punish something, do you get less of that behavior? And then the results were that a larger reward led to poorer performance. How can that possibly be, right? So if you give more things to students, their performance actually went down, it decreased. And how is that possible? Again, because they were being motivated or engaged with external things. So they were not really tapping into their intrinsic motivation. So they were sort of bribing students to do things. They were giving money or some rewards for them to be able to accomplish the tasks. That doesn't work very well, especially for highly cognitive things that demand your higher order thinking skills. So you need to be intrinsically motivated to be able to accomplish those things better, right? And that brings me to his EMP principle. So if you watch his TED Talk, if you read his book, you will see that he also mentions autonomy, and then he adds mastery and purpose. And guess what? Autonomy, in here, and the slide that I showed you before with Ryan and DC, they're equally important. Mastery, I think mastery we can connect with competence, right? The more I can master something, the more competent I become, and then I have a sense of achievement. And purpose is my legacy, my contribution. Why is this important for me, for my life, right? And I think sometimes students are not even aware of why they are doing things. When they're very little, they're young learners, maybe that won't make a difference because they can't project what they're going to do in a couple of years. But if they are teenagers and adults, that makes a lot of difference. Why am I doing this? What is the reason of this in my life? And then if you think about this term that is very much related to self-determination, motivation, how do you keep yourself on track? So Albert Bandura came up with this very interesting theory that he called self-efficacy. And there are a couple of elements that we can help our students with. So the first one is inactive mastery. So when you do something and you realize that you can do it, then you get more comfortable and more motivated to keep doing it. Because many times students are not engaged in the task or motivated throughout the semester because they feel they cannot do something and they don't even try. So they have to try, realize that they can, and then they can keep doing that. And then you have the other perspective. So vicarious experiences when you realize that other people can do something, and then by observing them, you realize that, oh, if they can do it, I can do it too. And that's something that we normally don't use as much as we could. I'm not saying you should compare students all the time, but I think you can tell your students who are not engaged or motivated throughout the semester, look, many people have done this before. I'm sure you can do it too. I'll help you, right? And then you can give them verbal persuasion, not just you yourself as a teacher telling them, come on, you got this, you can do it, but also yourself telling yourself. So the student telling themselves, looking in the mirror and saying, yes, I can do it. So this is very effective. And finally, their emotional state. So many times they just have to express their emotions so that they can get it out of their way, and then they can focus on the task at hand. Sometimes when students come to the lesson, especially in this time of remote teaching, they are not in the proper emotional state. And one thing that we can do to break the ice at the beginning, so everybody's sad and tired, you can do a very silly quiz about llamas, and maybe you can get them in the right emotional state. You can do a true or false or whatever, just to lighten up the mood, right? And speaking of lighten up the mood, I always have brain breaks as well. So it's time for our brain break. And remember Mr. Trunk, my travel buddy, look at him. So Mr. Trunk, the tiny elephant. So I want you to select the best alternative. Which of these countries has Mr. Trunk not been to? So write your answer in the chat box. Okay. C, Iceland, okay. Argentina, yes, Turkey. Okay. All right, you're going to be surprised, but yes, the answer is C, Turkey. And I'm going to prove that to you. I have some pictures. So you can see that Mr. Trunk is in front of the Royal Palace in Madrid, in Spain. In Argentina, in Buenos Aires, what is the name of this beautiful monument there? I think it's Florales Genérica or something like that, right? Yes, wonderful place. And then Mr. Trunk in Guadalajara, in Mexico. And in Iceland, I know that doesn't look like Iceland because my student didn't take very good photos, but he's been there anyway. And you can follow his adventures with hashtag Mr. Trunk, okay? Now let's talk from a more neuroscientific perspective. So you have the brain, and I have my brain here. So I always take my brain everywhere with me. So and I have a picture of a brain there to show, yes, if I forget my brain, I don't think right? I have to take my brain with me. So you have some very important areas that are activated when we are engaged, because engagement from a neuroscientific perspective is actually rewarding for the brain. So for us to be engaged in whatever we are doing, we have to get a reward or a reward feeling in the brain. And those areas, they have to be activated. So you have this area right in the middle here called the ventral tegmental area. And then you have the nucleus accumbens that many scientists actually call this area the center of pleasure in the brain. And you also have the prefrontal cortex, because this is responsible for inhibiting control, inhibiting your behavior, switching tasks, higher order thinking skills, many things, right? So let me show you here with my brain. You can see that I actually highlighted those areas. So this is the ventral tegmental area, right? And this is the nucleus accumbens. And this is the prefrontal cortex. And this is what we call the dopaminergic pathway. because it produces, and somebody actually wrote that in the chat box, it produces dopamine. And dopamine is the neurotransmitter, or actually it's called a neuromodulator because it has so many functions that it's not just a neurotransmitter. So it's a neuromodulator that has a lot to do with feeling like doing things, you know? If you don't have the right amount of dopamine in your brain, you don't feel like doing things. They're not interesting for you. They're not rewarding for your brain. So what we want our brains to experience when we are engaged, what we want our students to have in their brains is dopamine, the right amount of dopamine so that they can engage in the stuff that we want them to do. And then those areas, they have to be communicating very well. And I always mention that a person who has depression, for example, might not be producing dopamine at the right levels, or might not be reuptaking dopamine in the right way. So some mechanism is not working very well, which means that you don't have enough dopamine in your brain to make you feel like doing things, right? Now, if you take a closer look, this is the pathway from the ventral tegmental area going through the nucleus accumbens and reaching the prefrontal cortex. We call that the mesolimbic dopaminergic tract or pathway, right? And the funny thing is, and this is very cool, if you look closer at a neuronal level, you know, you will see that the cells, and we call them neurons, right? Or the brain cells, they're popularly known as brain cells. You have one cell that comes before, and we call that the presynaptic cell or neuron. And the one that comes after, it's called the postsynaptic neuron. What happens is an electrical charge travels down the axon of the presynaptic cell and triggers the release of what's in the vesicle. So there are like little bags inside this cell, the first cell here on the top. And then those vesicles, they travel down, they merge with the membrane, and then they release whatever is inside. So in this case, it's dopamine. And then dopamine gets released into this cleft, that space. And then the other cell, the postsynaptic cell, has receptors that will capture the dopamine. And then you have that good feeling, yes, I want to do this. I feel like doing this. And this is fascinating. That's why I love neuroscience, right? But the thing is, again, we need to have that dopamine rush. We have to make it happen in the brain. Otherwise, we don't get engaged, right? So much that there was a study by Izuma and colleagues showing that we need to have not just the rush of doing things that we like, that are rewarding for the brain, but also the expectation is important. So when you know that you're going to have a pleasant experience, your brain starts producing dopamine already. How cool is that? And then when you have the pleasant experience, the experience that you are engaged in, you have another rush of dopamine, but then it's not as big as. So you can see that the peak is different. So I think I can show you with my spotlight here. So you can see that the first case, you get 50%, 100%. So basically, let's say there's a 50% chance that I will get a reward. I will receive something, right? So I have the expectation that I will receive something, but I don't know if I will. So 50% chance, right? So just the expectation gives me a dopamine rush. And when I get the reward, I get another dopamine rush, but it's a little smaller now, right? When I have 100% certainty that I will get a reward, I only have a dopamine rush for the expectation. And I don't get a rush for the reward itself because, you know, I was expecting it anyway. And then when it's, you know, an enigma, I don't know whether I'm going to get a reward or not. Nobody said anything. So, you know, it's a question mark. I don't have a rush for the expectation just when I get the reward. So what does that tell us for our lessons when we want our students to engage more? we want to sometimes let them know that there will be a reward so that they can create that expectation. And then they release more dopamine and they become more engaged. And then when we give them the rewards, they also get a rush of dopamine. And that means that they stay engaged longer. Just like I'm doing with you. I don't know if you realize that, but I'm actually kind of doing the marshmallow test with you. So if you want to watch the marshmallow test, it's a terrible, it's almost like torture for kids. But this is actually being referred to as one of the best predictors of success in kids when they become adults, because somebody comes with 2 marshmallows, right? Actually, they come with 1 marshmallow and they say, I will leave this marshmallow here and you can eat it now, but then you won't get another one. So if you wait until I come back, you can have 2 marshmallows, right? But then the person, the scientist, takes like 15 minutes to come back. And you can see what kids are doing there. They're struggling not to have the marshmallow. But if they can wait, the reward is better because they get 2 marshmallows, right? So if they can self-regulate, they are going to benefit from that. And that's what I'm trying to do with you. So I have a raffle for you. So I told you at the beginning, you were not expecting the raffle, which means that maybe just by telling you that there would be something, I increased the levels of dopamine in your brain. And now I will tell you what you have to do. And then when you get your reward, you will have more dopamine in your brain. So what I do normally with participants of, events like this, I do like a happy hour, online happy hour. So we can talk about your lessons. You can ask me questions and things like that. The only thing you have to do is post a picture on social media using the hashtag EDCRocks and happy hour. And you can post a picture of where you are, what you're doing, the screen, whatever. It doesn't matter what picture you post. It has to be related to the talk, of course. And then I will find you on social media. I will get the 5 most creative photos. And then I will contact you so that we can have a 1-hour happy hour talking about stuff. And then I can give you some tips on how to engage your students. And of course, I hope the ladies from eTools will join us, right? So, yes. Now let's remember, so I hope you got the instructions, right? Post a picture, use hashtag EDCRocks, hashtag happy hour. And as soon as I have time, I will look for your pictures, all right? Now, there is another explanation from the neuroscientific perspective. So you can see, this is very cool. This is a video by Susan Buchheimer at UCLA, and she shows that we have 2 different networks when we are engaged, and we have to be on the task positive network on the left. This network has to be active in the brain. The default mode network or task negative network has to be sort of suppressed, not active when we are engaged. And I want you to do that with me using your hands so that I can show you something. So I want you to touch both your index fingers. So put them together. They have to touch. All right. And then using your left hand, I want you to just spin them around like that, but they have to be touching, okay? So you can see that when one network is up, the other one is down. Can you do that? Great, because you only have 1 point of intersection, right? So you can easily exchange from one network to the other. Now I want you to put 2 fingers. You have to touch 2 fingers. Now the middle finger with the middle finger on the other hand, plus the index fingers. And try to do the same thing. Now, try to, see? Now you have 2 points of intersection. Now try 3 fingers. See if you can do that. It's impossible to do it, right? Because you don't have just 1 point of intersection. And that's exactly what happens in kids who are not typical or who don't have a typically developing brain. For example, autism or dyslexia or ADHD. They have too many points of intersection. So they cannot really transition from task positive to task negative and back and forth very easily. So they cannot really turn off the default mode network to actually actively pay attention, which means that they might not be engaged like typical brains, right? And if you look at the areas that are lighting up in the brain when you have a typical brain, right in the middle, they are the areas that belong to the reward system of the brain. So when somebody smiles at you, because we are social organisms, we learn from one another. When somebody smiles at you, those areas inside your brain are lighting up because they belong to the reward system. You are rewarded by the smile of someone. But a person who has autism cannot do that. You see that those areas are not lighting up because a smile is not rewarding to their brains, right? So you can see, so that explains a lot. You can see that kids who are not engaged, typical kids who are not engaged, might not be engaged because they cannot activate their task positive network, their attentional networks, which means they're still in the task negative network because maybe they don't like whatever they're doing, or maybe because they have some sort of condition in their brain that doesn't allow them to do that. So it could be nurture, nature, social, right? And more time for active retrieving. So I'll give you a couple of minutes for you to try to remember anything we've been discussing so far. And you can use your chat box there. Okay. Expectation and rewards. Come on, everyone. Somebody remembered my hashtag. That's great. Wonderful. Then pink. Yes. Autonomy, dopamine, rewarding for the brain. Very good. Love the arc. Yes. Dopamine, brain breaks, relatedness. Okay, wonderful. Perfect. So this is something that you should be doing more often with your students, by the way, active retrieval, because it's very important to reinforce those neuronal networks. So when you ask them to bring back those concepts to their working memory, you're helping them consolidate memory in a way. So always allow some time for you to retrieve concepts during the lesson, all right? Wonderful. Very good. Motivation, brain system. Excellent. And that brings me to the curious part of our presentation. Remember Nirvana, Chick Sent Me High? I don't know if you, I think there are some people from this part of the world where Nirvana came from, basically. And maybe you can tell us, what is Nirvana? What is the meaning of Nirvana? What does it relate to, in a way? Anybody? You can type in your chat box. Happiness. Yes? Okay. Oh, Katarina is here. Very good. We met, and I talked about him, remember? Excellent. Very good. Enlightenment. Yes, balance. So it has to be about achieving, let's say, higher state of mind and happiness, balance, equilibrium. Very good. Peace. Excellent. Perfect. And is this something that is very much related to Asian religions, Buddhism, for example, right? And why did I choose this? A state of vacuuming all energy. Okay, very nice. So why did I choose this term? Because I think it says a lot about where we want to get to. You know, this is like the final destination when you are in complete, utter bliss. Everything is perfect, peaceful, and there's harmony, there's balance, right? And this is what this guy talks about in terms of engagement and motivation. And then it took me a long time to learn how to pronounce his name. That's why Nirvana Chick Sent Me High. I actually started looking for, how am I going to say his name, right? So my first expression was probably like this girl, and then like this guy. right? I was, oh my gosh, you know, it's not easy for somebody who's not from that country. And I'm talking about Hungary, by the way. And then, of course, I thought like Obama might have thought when he was in that particular event as well. But then some people were so kind that they actually made a system for us to understand how we should pronounce his name. So Csikszentmihalyi, right? And so we have some people from Hungary here. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but it's Csikszentmihalyi, right? Or very close to that, hopefully. Then I understood how to pronounce his name. So his name is Mihai Csikszentmihalyi, right? Which is Michael, Saint Michael or something like that, right? It translated to the Western. Yes, exactly. And he is a very famous psychologist, professor from Hungary, the creator of flow theory. So he's the one who wrote about flow. And flow is this state of incredible balance and peace and harmony that we want to achieve when we have the perfect engaged student, the perfectly engaged student, right? And then he says that for you to achieve that, you have to get into this channel with the right amount of challenge and skills required. That he says it's called flow. So if there's too much challenge, students are not going to be engaged because it's too much for their working memory and for their emotions, and they're going to be anxious. So that causes anxiety. But then if you're not really asking them to use their skills in a way that is interesting and rewarding for their brains, you're going to cause boredom. So they're going to be bored, and then they cannot really be engaged. So you have to strike a balance, just like nirvana. You have to find equilibrium, right? How do you do that? That's the big question, and that's what I'm going to try to answer now. How do you get students to that state of flow? But then I want you to think of a moment of flow in your life. When did you have flow? When did you experience flow the last time? Somebody's asking about the ZPD, the zone of proximal development, right? Yeah, in a way, the zone of proximal development is much more related to helping your students achieve their potential by providing support, by scaffolding, right? And maybe it's not so connected in that sense, because flow is much more about being in the moment and experiencing things and remembering things as they come and engaged, right? But do you remember what you were doing when you were in flow? So, and if you want to use the chat box to mention anything. So when was the last time you experienced flow? And when you experience flow, you are having such a positive experience that you don't actually feel time passing. Just, you're there in the moment, you're totally engaged in whatever it is that you're doing. So exactly, Antonella, can you give an example? So anybody, can you give an example? When was the last time that you were so into the moment that you could, wow, it's been hours and I'm still doing the same thing? Learning modern theories of education, my master's degree in didactics. Excellent. Play Monopoly. Good. Exactly. Learning Italian, tennis match with my son, storytelling. Perfect. So those are excellent examples of flow. How can we get our students to experience that in our lessons so that they can be fully engaged? I've had those moments with my students. I bet you've had them too. It's when the bell rings, when we're back in face-to-face classes, right? The bell rings and they go like, oh my God, it's over? We want to stay more, right? Or even now in remote teaching is when, time's up, but they feel like, wow, this was really great, interesting. I don't want to leave. I could stay here longer and longer, right? So I really want you to dig into that concept of flow. How do you create that in your students? I might not have the answer, but I will give you some tips, hopefully. You have to avoid apathy. because apathy is when the level of challenge is very low and the level of skills required is also very low. So you know your students better than anyone. You know that this is not going to be challenging for my student. So then if that's the case, don't do it, don't use it. Try to change it. Try to add challenge to it. This is not going to require my students to use their skills at a certain level. Don't do it, don't use it. The problem is if you're teaching more than 2 students, because that's, 2 students, that's it. You need to think of differentiation because different students require different levels of challenge and they use different levels of skills, right? Exactly. And then you have to think of moments of ecstasy when you did something that really caught their attention. They were completely engaged and they were doing the things that you require them to do. So you have to try to simulate that situation once again, right? One of the things that we can do, and now the practical tips for you, we can look at my professor's framework, Paul Howard-Jones. He has talked about that in a very recent webinar we hosted, and I'm gonna show you how to find that webinar later. And there's a framework that he developed with other researchers that is actually quite simple. It's engage. So the very first thing you have to do with your students is engage them so that you can start building new knowledge and consolidating learning, right? And I think the worst thing we can do as teachers is when we start teaching without engaging. So that's why I actually make a point of taking 5, even 10 minutes at the beginning of every webinar to tell you silly things about me, like that I love yamas and that I played in a band, because those things are engaging. I know it might not feel like they are engaging, but they are, because you get to know the human being behind the screen here, and that's engaging. So you have to spend time doing those things. Otherwise, they are not going to be engaged. And then when you already know who you are teaching, you have to find other strategies. So maybe you can start with a game. Maybe you can do an icebreaker. They can tell you something interesting that happened to them to be engaging at the beginning. That's as important as everything else. Don't be one of those teachers, okay, so let's go to page whatever. No, don't start the lesson like that. Engage your students first, otherwise it doesn't work, right? And then you can start building, and then of course, after a while, after a couple of times revisiting stuff, then you consolidate memory. Now, my framework, the one that I developed with my dissertation, also puts engagement at the beginning because that's the very first thing. But then I actually merged Paul's, build and consolidate into one that is, I call memory. So we have to engage our students and work with their memories. And then we have to personalize because every student is different. So we can personalize by differentiating, for example. We have to think of active learning methods. We also have to think about beliefs and attitudes. So whether they believe they can do something or not, if they are in the right state of mind or not, if they can control their behavior or not. And finally, of course, continuous assessment. So that's my framework. And I believe that this is actually something that can help us reflect on whether we are taking the right steps when we're teaching. Because normally when we think about teaching and learning, we only think about memory. If my students are going to remember the concepts, grammar, vocabulary that I teach them. So we don't think necessarily about the other things, right? They have to be present. They have to be in our lesson plan. And engaging is definitely one of them. So how do you do it? I'm going to share the secrets now, and then hopefully, and then you can ask me questions, and I'm going to try to make some parallels, or to draw some parallels between engaging in face-to-face lessons and online lessons, right? So Paul Howard-Jones says that for you to engage your students, you have to remind them that every brain is unique. So you need to differentiate. because what engages, this student doesn't necessarily engage the other student. So you have to have a differentiated type of instruction so that your students can be there with you in the lesson. You also have to use the approach response, and I'm going to show you in a second what that means. And you also have to reduce fearfulness and anxiety, because if you create a lot of anxiety, you are not in the flow channel, right? You leave the flow channel because too much challenge, for example. And you have to remind them that their brains are plastic, so they can always learn. That's what brains do. Brains learn. We can always find a way to learn. In my framework, the first theme is engagement. And the things that I think we need to do more often are, we have to share lesson goals, because I think students need to be aware of the big picture. So that's why every time I have a webinar, I try very hard to show the sections that we're going to follow, right? And then also activate mirror neurons. So we need to be and do what we want our students to be and do, So basically, if I want our students to be enthusiastic about something, I have to be enthusiastic, because the neurons that activate in my brain will activate in their brain because they are observing me. So if I want them to do something that requires a certain amount of skill, I should do it in front of them so that I can demonstrate how it's done. And then the same areas in their brains are going to activate, right? I also have to work with classroom management, because some people might be disengaging. So if you look at Schlechty's levels of engagement, if there's a rebellious kid in the lesson, in the class, you have to do something about it. Otherwise, this will infect all the others, will disengage the others. So you have to work with classroom management. And there are some techniques you can use. And I feel like establishing rapport is probably one of the best techniques, because students who like you are less likely to disrespect you and disengage in your lesson. And the older, the better, of course, because kids, they still cannot self-regulate enough. But they will realize that if you are, let's say, sad or angry because they have done something, that they have to respect you. And finally, motivate students, because, engagement has to do with motivation, but in the long run, right? So we have to find a way to motivate them, find what they like, maybe align with their interests, right? Now, what is approach response? There are a couple of things that you should have in your lesson that will somehow help your students be engaged. Share attention with them. So they have, I think I'm running out of battery. Let me just get this here before it turns off. So you need to share attention with your students so that they realize that there's a human being right there looking at them, and that's important for the brain. So one of the things that you can do online, you have to ask all of your students to keep their cameras on. Otherwise, there's no way they will be engaged. I know it's hard, but you have to, it has to be one of the rules. Keep their cameras on. Novelty, even if they have seen something, present it in a new way. Use something very unexpected. That's great. Praise is rewarding for the brain. So you don't have to give them rewards like physical rewards, money, tokens, or whatever. You can just tell them, wow, this is excellent. If it is excellent. If it's not excellent, then don't say it, because then you are not promoting a growth mindset. But you have to tell them when they deserve that they did a great job, and the brain likes that. And again, we go back to autonomy. So you have to give them choice. So that's the approach response. Some of the things about the approach response. And then I told you that we need to use the mirror neuron system. So every time, and I really miss the face-to-face, workshops and lectures, body language. So people have told me that I'm very enthusiastic, so I use my hands a lot. I cannot do that so much here. But I think that teachers who do that, they will probably be more engaging. Their students are going to be more interested in listening to them. And again, enthusiasm. You want your students to be enthusiastic about what they need to do. You have to be enthusiastic as well. I've had teachers who told me to do something very interesting, but in such a boring way that I didn't want to do it anymore. So we have to do it in a very enthusiastic way for us to activate those neurons in our kids' brains, right? Yeah, there are some students who will not turn on their cameras. Yes, exactly. So this is a challenge, right, Randy? I will give you some examples now, but again, no magical solutions. I'm just helping you reflect. There's no formula I can give you that will work 100% of the time. Unfortunately, some students will not open their cameras, right? I watched this great video by Rob Plevin, and I think he basically summarized everything. So this is the blessed part, and then you can ask me questions. So I'm going to show you all the things that he shared in his video. And I will tell you where they belong. There is actually a broader theme where those things belong. So I'll give you some time to read the things. So, okay, I think you had time. So basically success, achievement, recognition, and praise, you give them a sense of empowerment. So if you empower your students, if they have voice and choice, they are going to be more engaged. If they feel like they're making progress, they're going to be more engaged. Cooperative teams, community support, and relationships, you give them a sense of belonging. If they feel that they're part of the group, you create peer pressure. And then they will do things because they want the group to be proud of them, because they belong to the group. This is very, primal behavior. We want to be part of a group. We do the stuff that the group is doing. And then you also have active humor, novelty, challenge, and variety. So this is a sense of fun, So if you empower your students, if you make them realize that they belong in the group, and if they're having fun, there's no reason why they shouldn't be engaged. From a neuroscientific perspective, it's going to be rewarding for their brains, and they're going to be engaged, right? Think about this guy. Do you know who this guy is? This is Albert Einstein, one of the most, I'd say, popular, famous scientists and physicists of all time. And so he traveled to the US to give a lecture on physics to Black men who at the time were not always allowed in a school, in a university, depending on the state, right? Can you imagine how engaged they all are to receive one of the biggest references in physics to actually teach them? Everyone is so engaged except for this guy. He's sleeping, but everyone else is engaged. You can tell they are actually paying attention. And that has a lot to do with his theory of relativity, right? So he states that time flies when you're having fun. And that has everything to do with flow as well. So we want to simulate that feeling that we have when we're having fun, when everything is perfectly balanced. There's harmony, there's peace, I'm being challenged, I'm using my skills. Try to think of those things when you are preparing your next lesson, right? And if you want to learn from the man himself, you can go to Brastiço YouTube channel. So Brastiço is our committee here in Brazil. And look for, I think probably the last webinar, Paul Howard Jones's webinar on the evolution of the learning brain, which was excellent. He's a wonderful professor. And he will give you more tips on how to engage your students, build knowledge, and consolidate learning. Now, the checkpoints, hopefully you can help me here. Did I share the goals with you? So you can use your chat box to say yes or no. Did I share the goals? Yes. Did I introduce any novelty? Hopefully. I hope so. Was I any enthusiastic? Was there any enthusiasm? Yes, definitely. Okay. Did you actually receive a reward? You might, win the raffle. So, so it was engaging. I hope so. So that's the engagement checklist. And the final message, I had the wonderful opportunity to interview this guy, John Bergman, for Hub Edify a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month or so ago. And he says, and I think that basically envelops what we're discussing here. He said during the interview, you know what makes good learning? Active learning and relationships. So if they have a voice and choice and they like you, there's rapport, because being with you is rewarding for their brains. They are going to be engaged, I understand that now we are facing a lot of challenges, but we have to be, we have to go back to that time when we were listening to our students more often and trying to make them learn according to their differences. And maybe we can be more engaging to them. Now, I hope we have time for questions. And I don't know if I answered all the questions because they were very, broad topics, but I think how do you do those things online is probably one of the biggest questions, right? And I see that there's some very, very interesting comments in the chat box. But I'll tell you, I think we can transition many of those things online, but we have to be more careful of, how we do things. So for example, kids are sitting in front of a screen for hours and hours every day. That's not engaging. So one of the things you can do online, you can ask them to move around, but then how do you get them back? That's a challenge. So maybe you can maybe align with your parents that kids, they should change rooms now and again when they're having lessons with you, because then it's going to be a little bit more rewarding. Instead of having lessons in the kitchen all the time or in the living room, so you go to the balcony or your room, so you can kind of rotate. That could be a little more engaging. Have them keep their cameras on. That's very important. Otherwise, you cannot know if they're engaged or not. Make sure you ask random questions, because then that kind of forces them to be engaged. You're going to say, Cecilia, open your mic right now. What do you think, Cecilia? So, that forces her to be there, attentive, right? I think there are many people who want to open their mics and share. So please, the problem is I'm not sure I can answer all of you, but who wants to say something?
There are some questions coming up in the chat.
Okay.
So, well, first of all, you are invited to open your mics if you want to ask André your question. Otherwise, I can read some of the questions here if you
Wonderful.
have some minutes.
Sure. Yes, I can stay a little longer. Yeah.
Great. Okay. So, Mailen says that at the beginning you mentioned that being active requires students to be active. So how can we work on that with little children in remote teaching when they are at home with their mothers by their side, and they are all the time asking her, Mom, can you bring me some water? Mom, can I have a cookie? I'm hungry.
Yes,
Sounds familiar.
That's a great question. I'm afraid I don't have a very good solution for that. And I have to be very honest with you. I don't think remote teaching was meant for very young learners, And I'm speaking from a psychological, neuroscientific perspective. Kids, they learn in the presence of others, like physical presence of others. And we know that even if you go back to Lev Vygotsky, the social interactionists, right? And we have to observe others. When you do that remotely, you create this artificial environment. And we have a lot of studies. There was a report by MIT a couple of years ago, and they replicated the same experiment again, showing that very, very young learners, they don't learn very well remotely. But it's what we have now. So, and we have to do it somehow. I think the ideal scenario would be if parents could be our allies, So when they cannot do whatever their kids are asking, now it's time for the lesson. so that they can practice self-regulation, emotional intelligence. But also they should be able to do the stuff we ask them to do. So, let's imagine we want to do something more hands-on with kids, when we want to play a game with them, because that's how they learn. So we need to count on parents to do that for us, because we're not there with them. And if parents are not there, kids are not going to do it, because they don't have the self-regulation to do it. They're not autonomous enough to say, okay, let me do it and come back. They'll probably just wander around the house and disappear, if there's nobody there. So that would be the ideal scenario, to count on their parents for help. But then their parents are working. They cannot always be there. Or maybe their kids are asking a lot of questions all the time. And, I want a cookie. And then parents give those things to them during the lesson. So ideally, we should have parents who are our allies and who don't do everything kids ask them to do, because that's going to get in the way of learning, Okay, so there. But again, I don't have a solution for you. Yes.
Okay, thank you. We have a participant who wants to share her thoughts.
Yes,
Amalia?
please.
Amalia, you can open your mic.
Yeah, let me stop sharing.
Okay, hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Let
me tell you that I have loved your presentation, and it has opened a few questions in my mind.
Yes, sure.
I wanted to participate because I do not really know a lot about neurosciences related to education. The thing is, and this is the question I'd like to ask you and the participants, if any of them has an answer. What's the place within neurosciences for subjectivity? I mean, Freud himself was a neuroscientist, sorry, and he himself said that you could not explain psychological things in humans through neurons.
Yep.
I mean, what makes us unique, I think, of course I may be wrong, is exactly that, our subjectivity.
Yes.
Not neurons, not because if so, non-easy learners may have a pill to foster, I am being sarcastic of course, to foster dopamine. And we know that, especially in Argentina, I'm from Argentina and I'm from a very, very tiny city, La Rioja, we are having a lot of problems or issues related to emotions and equilibrium and stability with our students, and they're not related to brains. I mean, they are related to subjectivity. So what's the place, or if there's a place for subjectivity within neurosciences? Because I kind of feel that everything comes from the normal or the abnormal. I rather think that our students do not cannot be classified within the normal or the abnormal.
Yes.
But
perfect.
within a very wide range of different kinds of logics. I don't know if I am clear.
Sure. Yes, very clear. I agree with you, and that's a great question. And like I said before, that's why we use this transdisciplinary area of knowledge that we call mind-brain education, because brain is organic, concrete. We can see it, we can touch it, we can even smell it if we want, But the mind, we cannot do those things, because the mind is more about subjectivity. And then if you just look at neuroscience, and from a neuroscientific perspective, you cannot explain a lot of things. But if you ally neuroscience, psychology, and education, you can explain more, and you can provide more evidence for what's happening in the lesson inside our kids' heads, so that they are acting in a certain way or not, right? And also, neuroscience can explain very well why we have certain emotions. So emotions they are physiologically created in the brain. So we know that we have areas such as the amygdala, the hypothalamus, for example, the striatum, so that are very active when we are experiencing an emotion. But then the way we filter that and the way we project that in the real world has a lot to do with psychology, because maybe we can experience something in the brain, but we can use our mind to change the way we act upon that, right? So I don't think neuroscience holds the answer of anything for education unless we ally neuroscience with psychology and pedagogy, andragogy, and everything. And you said emotional intelligence, for example. Neuroscience has already highly correlated performance with self-regulation, emotional intelligence. So we know from a neuroscientific perspective that if kids are not taught to constrain themselves, for example, to manage their own behavior, in the long run, they're going to look for that dopamine rush of, that we parents sometimes give them, because we think, they are feeling bad, they're feeling sad, they're feeling tired. I'm going to give them an external motivator. I'm going to distract them from that feeling. So they will never be able to deal with that feeling. They will build this sort of mindset that will require them to find those distractors when they are adults. And they are much more susceptible to using drugs in adulthood, for example. So what we know from a neuroscientific perspective is that neuroscience can only go so far. But then we have to look at the other sciences that study behavior, emotions, how we learn, the learning theories, because otherwise we can't. It's very prescriptive. It's very, neuroscience is much more organic, a much more exact science than anything else. But then we have psychology, which is not. So if you put those two together, you create something else, right?
Okay, thanks a lot. I will study more on it, and I will follow you to your webinars.
Wonderful.
And I will keep on asking.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Does anybody have any other questions or comments? I can see the dopamine.
Yeah, well, there are a lot of comments coming up in the chat box, and I think that everybody has learned a great deal of new things today, and we have so many things to reflect upon about our approach to teaching and learning. So, André, we appreciate a lot that you are here, and thank you so much for what you've been sharing with us. And also I think all of us had a lot of fun listening to you while we were learning. So actually we saw everything you told us in action. So I think that it's also fantastic.
Wonderful.
So thank you.
Well, I thank you very much for this opportunity, and I really hope that everyone learned something interesting, something practical. Remember to give your students a sense of empowerment, to give them a sense of belonging and a sense of fun, and also to help them self-regulate. I think that's one of the biggest problems, that we just distract students from their emotions, and then in the long run, they are going to seek something else to be entertained. And then we have to teach them that sometimes they cannot be entertained. They have to be on task, because that's what they have to do. Just like we have to work, we have to do things we don't always like, and we have to teach them those things. And we have to count on their parents' help to reinforce that behavior. Otherwise, it doesn't work very well. And then if we put all those things together, hopefully we will have more engaged students, not many rebellious students, those who make our lives hell, those who start misbehaving in class. And then, of course, the impact on their learning outcomes will be much more positive. So if you have learned something, please let me know, follow me on social media, send me questions, and then I'll be glad to answer.
Okay, thank you, André, and thank you all for being here. And before we go, I just want to answer a question that is in the chat box. And the question is, when is the next seminar, with the webinar? Which is great.
Well, yeah.
Yeah, Randy, Randy, I'm so happy to tell you that André is very often delivering webinars and also lives on Instagram. So you are all invited to follow him on @EDC Rock rocks. And also you can enter his blog, etcrocks.com. Is that right, André?
Yes,
Yes,
that's
is that
the
right?
one.
Okay.
Yes.
And there you will find courses, master classes, and also great articles on everything he was mentioning today. So and they are as awesome as he is when he speaks. So you better go
Thank
and
you
check
very
them
much.
out.
And if I may, there's actually an event taking place next Friday for the Catholic University of Argentina. I'm not sure it's open for everyone, but you can check. So you go to uca.ar, maybe, I don't know, and then you can find information. I'm going to talk about neuromyths. So maybe I can see some of you there.
Yes, we will share the event. We will share the information about that event so everyone can pay a look and maybe attend and be there and participate. So thank you again, André, and thank you all of you from all around the world. We hope you enjoyed it. We know you enjoyed listening to André, and okay, I hope we can meet again soon with another webinar. So thank you, and I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you all.
So bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye, André. Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.